Hi, everybody. It's Achilles Justice here with the Philosophy Society. We are in the Toronto Metropolitan Student Learning Center again. It is April 2nd, 2024. So last week we were talking about the nature of, like, what does it mean to be a wise group, and looking at the specific properties of the relations between people. And we came to some things that were important, like communication, feedback, listening, empathy, the value of understanding, and why those things are necessary to be wise, in the sense that, like, we can make sound judgments and not make mistakes that we find as cognitive biases or social biases within groups, like groupthink, for example. So just a quick heads up, I ordered the new version of the 30th anniversary edition of the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. We're going to be starting that book soon. And we may also start doing film night again. We can do it in this room because there is a TV here. So for the film nights, the recordings are going to be not of the film, but any discussions that we have based on the film, I'll just record it, and maybe I'll just pause it or something like that while the film's going on. When we're doing the presentation of the book stuff, going through the material, there'll be some recording of that. I will have slides, so I will be recording myself with the slides, and then we can go through that content for the book. I'm going to need to have some preparation time because that's going to be more of like a course. I'm not just going to be winging it like I'm doing here, like we're doing like a think tank kind of thing. The think tank thing is important because you can discover new things, right? You're not going in with a preconception or a script. I'm like thinking out loud almost. I think that's what philosophy in a lot of ways is learning how to think about things, and that's kind of why I approach it that way. So the 7 Habits is very good, and I look forward to going through it again. And yeah, so for today, I'm going to try the blue marker again. So we have our group, the relation, and then we have like the individual, right? And there's this notion of self-awareness. So that's in some ways, and the self-awareness property, we can go back to Plato in our Wizard's Tower of Philosophy. There's a little window here, and Plato's in the window. And in his book called The Apology, he talks about an unreflected life is not worth living. And what he's really just saying is being self-aware or reflecting on yourself. So this is the point about reflection. It is in some ways tied to what it means to be wise. And so self-awareness, we could say, is, if we look at time, okay, and this is the present. Over here, we would have the future, and over here is the past. Right? The present is kind of where self-awareness resides. And in the past, we would kind of call that reflection. So when someone says, I'm reflecting, you'd be thinking about what's already happened, which is going to be relative to your memory. So in our wisdom, and we have like not really committing errors, which falls in the sound judgment property, there are a lot of memory biases, right? Our memories are reconstructed in the moment that we do the retrieval of the information. There's not like a computer where it's saved and the retrieval is bringing back information that is like in a specific state. So if I remember this one time when I was like 8 and I used to walk towards the school or my grandmother's house, and there was this tree with a fence, that memory is being created now, right? Like, it's not like it is bringing back an exact copy of the video, and then I'm replaying it and I'm re-experiencing that old copy. It is a new experience that is being created, right? Mm-hmm. So there's a whole bunch of different kinds of memory biases that can occur. And so we have to be cautious of this reflection area. And every kind of part of this, there's going to be some way that the brain can make mistakes. right? So errors, and this is, and so we want to reduce those amounts of errors in just how our brain functions. That's good for us. That way we're more accurate in how we're using it, right? It's like making sure that your wheels are aligned. If your wheels aren't aligned, then the car will kind of steer itself in one direction when you don't hold the wheel, right? You'll always have to counter adjust whatever the lack of alignment would be. So there is in some ways certain predispositions, i.e. biases, towards thinking about things in a certain way, like the self-serving bias. So within our self-awareness, we have this thing called self-serving bias, which is we always see ourselves better than average, generally. Most humans, when they ask, how good are you at reading? I'm really good. I'm awesome. So out of like 100%, what would you be? I'm like 89, right? And most people would say on a variety of skills that they're better than everybody else. But everybody can't be better than average because average would be like the halfway point. Some people necessarily have to be below 50, right? But for our self-esteem or our self-concept, it's just, being accurate about our skills won't necessarily make us feel good. Because if we're stuck at something, you could feel bad about that. Oh, I'm not good at this, whatever it might be, right? So we have this self-serving bias to kind of bolster our self-esteem or the way we see ourselves, our self-concept, so that we don't feel shitty about the things we suck at, right? That's one explanation of why it's there. And so the problem with that, though, is that we can become, for example, overconfident. That's another bias, right? Where we think, I do this often, where we see ourselves as being so good at stuff that we'll take on more than we can realistically do. And then when we're in the situation, we become overwhelmed, and then all these other problems occur in life, right? So it's like, oh, I can take care of all the kids, I can have a job, I can go to school, and I can go to this yoga class, and I can do this dance thing, like I can do everything, right? And then when you're actually in the moment where there's stress, and then there's like unexpected things that occur, and so it can become a problem. And so I'm just saying that the biases exist, is basically what I'm saying. So in the present, we have self-awareness. Another way to say this is that mindfulness. And mindfulness is just when you're in the moment, your mind is kind of aware of everything that's going on around you, right? This is like the mind. And so there might be like a sound. You could have like a tactile feeling. There could be like something visual, right? There's another sound over here. And the mindfulness is just allowing the stimulus. So, right? The thing that affects your sensory perception to have its effect, but you don't invest attention to it. After its effect has occurred, you allow its effect to pass so that you can maintain mindfulness of all that is existing in your experience, right? And so what that's kind of teaching you, this mindfulness, in some ways is inhibition, or like letting go of what's in mind. And that's useful when we have like upsetting things that occur to us, because I can be mindful of how upset. So another one would be like emotion, or I feel something, right? I'm upset about this, and I can be aware so that my emotions don't consume my mind. So if my mind, we don't want the emotion to be like larger than the mind, where it takes control of you. You want it in the sense that the emotion only goes so far, right? And then I have other awareness right here. So I'm aware of how intense the emotion would be, but my mind is always greater than the emotion. And that will increase self-control, right? So we get, the self-control is important for us so that the emotion's not taking control. In this one, it's like emotion control. And at least your emotions may allow you to do something. Like if you're angry with something, that might motivate you to make a change in life. Like I'm pissed off that, my employer did something. They scheduled me in this way, or they didn't give me this project, or they didn't recognize the effort I put it in a certain way. And if you're upset about that, that could motivate you to get a new job, right? But if the anger pushes you in such a way that you start yelling at your boss or your team, the anger is directing you, right, in a way that's unhealthy and destructive. In some instances, maybe you still have control within the anger, and you're very stern in your voice, and it is a healthy thing in some ways. But again, the most important point is that you're in control of yourself. And then we want to make sure that we have the capacity for decisions and action, right? When I'm being mindless and mindful, right? And so the emotional control, you want to have self-control, right? Decisions and actions, we would be on this side being impulsive or reactive. And this does go to what we talked about earlier about Stephen Covey's first principle of being proactive, right? That would be in the mindful category. So the future is almost like a projection. I'm saying like, what if? Or it's like hypothetical. Also, it has to do with our expectations. So I am projecting what do I think is going to happen in the future. And this also, from a logical standpoint, has to do with induction. The future will be like the past. That comes from our philosopher Hume, from over here. And so there can be errors in the present moment, right? Our self-evaluation, and there can be errors in our future projection. Well, wisdom, so there can be errors in each one of these things. And so for the wisdom point, we want to like reduce the errors, right? That's kind of what we're doing here. Now, for the group part, all of this information is kind of all put into the one individual. Each person, you would want them to be doing this stuff, right? Now, for the group relation, we're going to have certain things that occur in this context that don't necessarily occur over here. So one would be like groupthink, right? In the sense that we're more likely to disregard certain criticisms or problems in a decision when there's a lot of pressure to just make that decision, right? And so how do we, for example, with groupthink, how do we resolve that? We want to have a positive, open value for feedback and criticism. So what that means is that you're not going to have reprisal or punish somebody for raising a criticism, right? So when we talk about criticism, let's put this up here. So one skill, criticism / feedback. There's first part is the content, right? Like, what is the error? And then the other one is like the style or the medium. How did you say it? And so when we look at the mindful approach, the individual is aware of their style. And I make this mistake sometimes. I'm not being aware, and we need to work on that, right? Everyone needs to. That's me being humble, right? I'm like, I fuck up too. And so the style is being aware of how we say things. And what is the best way for me to translate that information, the content, so that the other person is receptive to it, right? So in our skills, one of the skills directly related to like we call them wisdom skills, right? Within a group context is learning how to give, what is the nature of criticism and feedback. And part of that is being Socratic, right? Which when I say that, I mean, we want the feedback to be relevant to what is going on, right? It would be a critical thinking error to talk about something else, like an attack on the person's character. That has nothing to do with like how they're coding or something like that. Someone's doing coding and there's an error in the code, saying the guy is like, I don't know, he's too short to be able to be a coder, or his hands are too stubby to use the thing. That has nothing to do with the person's ability to code, because you can have like a voice thing and talk into it. It's just there's a specific error with the code itself, right? So we want to make sure that the being Socratic as a skill, that would also, we'll just put that down. That is also something that we want to work on. These are the things that we would do individually, but then as a group, we want to make them of value, which will engage one of the forces of a group, which is the socialization force, right? This is like a force of nature in some ways, but for humans. And it will enable values / habits in the group, right? So there's like a way that we treat each other and we act each other. And that's what I mean about the wise group's construction, is how do we direct the socialization? So for example, in a religious group, there's going to be a specific way to pray, okay? And each religion will socialize its members on that way to pray. So for Islam, they pray 5 times a day, right? They kneel on the ground, they bow to the sun or something. And that's the mechanism of prayer, that if you do it incorrectly, they will correct you on. You will be socialized to practice in this way for the value, right? In Catholicism, there's like the Eucharist, and there's a certain way to receive the Eucharist from either the priest or the priest's friend that helps you, that distributes the cracker, right? And if you do it incorrectly, like for example, you have to have palms up, I'm pretty sure. If you went like this, they would say, no, you must do it this way for whatever reason, right? Or if you like put your elbow out, you're like, put the cracker on there, and then you try to eat it on your elbow, which can't happen. That they would say, no, you can't do that, right? And so in this context, we want to be aware of socialization conceptually and as like a social or a psychological force. This is something that occurs, right? And then how can we use this force to create the group in a way that it's not going to make these errors of things like groupthink, right? And so a way to do that is to say that when someone asks a question, they say, well, what do you mean by that? We would respond by listening, allowing the question to come in, right? And then entertaining the question in a certain kind of way. Whereas if you look at like the Kremlin's Russia, and you say, well, why did you go to war with Ukraine? And then they beat you down and throw you in prison for 10 years. That is an alternative socialization practice that is not conducive to a wise group. It's not. It's conducive to an authoritarian state. So, right? And then this is the reason that philosophy is important, because you can have a psychological group. You say, this is the psychology society. Okay, sure. But we need to be able to discuss why the philosophy society is distinct from the authoritarian society. Why is it the case that it's not a good idea to have an authoritarian state? Well, this is why. And then that's the conceptual philosophy. And then this is the practical stuff. These are the things that you do to uphold the other thing, right? And so the force of socialization is the underpinning, like if there was like a thing down here that all of these things are like connected to, right? One of the main founding elements is that socialization, right? How values and practices are instilled. And the mechanism itself is through kind of how we respond to each other. Predominantly, it happens to kids when they're growing up. This is how we act. This is how we behave. If you're a good boy or a good girl, right? But as adults, there's still the same thing. You see that in the workplace, right? You're at work on time. If you're not, there's a mechanism to gear you in, to herd you to behave in a specific way. So an anarchistic kind of, like philosophy has been very anarchistic. It's unorganized. It's just kind of free-for-all renegade. You know, being philosophical, there's no organization. It's just, you're just a philosopher, like Nietzsche in the cloud, not in the clouds, but Nietzsche in the cave, in the forest, you know, Zarathustra. That's just what philosophy is. But it's unwise to not organize philosophy because of all the things I've been talking about for how long.
There's also like in terms of business and economics, the current trend is related to intangibles, which is basically saying people related assets, which is related to ESG, if you've heard of that. So it's like a new set of criteria to judge a corporation or business on.
Okay.
And part of what's involved with intangibles is basically what you're talking about here.
Okay, interesting.
So it's like there's a strong philosophical component to it.
Sweet. All right, cool. This is like the how we relate this to the certain current business practices. So the renegade philosopher would say, socialization is a bad thing, right? Because it's, you know, we can make a whole bunch of explanations for that. It can be used in a bad way, but its existence, you're never going to get rid of its existence. Just like categorization. These are like forces of the mind. Like to categorize things happens automatically. There are conceptual problems with categorization, right? Like how we define stuff, what goes in the circle and what goes out of the circle, you know, necessary and sufficient conditions. And we can talk about that. And Wittgenstein's family resemblances is a whole discussion. But psychologically, these are things that occur. They are forces of nature. Because if we didn't socialize each other, if we weren't responsive, and those that are unresponsive to socialization practices, we basically just, they can't function as a human being, right? It becomes a mental health issue, right? And so, or judgment, don't judge me. What do you really mean by that? What do you mean by judgment? Like the assessment of the quality of a thing, like measurement. You know, I am judging that that's like 9 feet away, the door, right? Or like 3.5 meters, 1, 2, 3, 3.2 meters, something like that, right? I'm making a judgment. Moral judgment is a little different. Was that good or bad? Right? But your brain kind of just does that. And then you put language after. Like first we make a judgment, and then we have to describe the feeling to ourselves. Like, what was that? That was bad. Okay, now what am I going to do? Not going back there again. Like if you saw a waiter and then be like, here you go, you know, you'd be like, whoa. Does he have my credit card? Because I'm getting the cutting here right now. That's like, that was bad, right? Even if it was like the mask was on and they sneezed, you'd be like, no, not eating that food, right? So the renegade philosopher will say, let us philosophize these things to the point where we want to get rid of them. That's like saying, when we look at the periodic table of elements, we're going to remove carbon. I don't like carbon because it's responsible for all organic matter. You know, if carbon didn't exist, we wouldn't have all these problems in the world. Yeah, okay, that's true, but it doesn't make any sense, right? It doesn't make sense to not, you are a social being, and therefore philosophy will always be tied to that. And so the wise philosopher is not the one that commits themselves to some specific kind of dogma, because that's the same thing that a religious group does, right? The wise philosopher is one that accepts these are functions of the mind or of being human, and how can we incorporate those into being philosophical? And that's what I mean when I talk about the wise group, is that these properties are already inherently part of group processes. They're already there, whether you like it or not. And if you don't take responsibility, that's when you get like the Putins and the Trumps and the Xi Jinpings who are like, okay, go ahead. Okay, people, you don't want to take responsibility? We will, and we will be in power, and we will do whatever we want. Like, it's been like that more so than it's been the alternative way. Like, democracy is like what? It's pretty young in comparison to the powerful being in control. Right? Like, if you just looking like in the animal kingdom, either it's the strongest animal or fastest or whatever, like physiological ability, or it just goes by group, right? Maybe there's like a really big monkey or a gorilla, but that there's like 7 medium ones, they can all gang up on the one big one. And so there has to be this balance between the two, power and then the people or the many, right? And so there's these functions, these things that occur, and it's not saying, don't categorize me, I'm non-binary. It's like, okay, well, like the mind and the brain does things because that's the way that in some ways, A, reality is, and B, that's what it means to be human, is to make judgments, right? Whether the judgment is correct or not. So these things are almost automatic, right? And then we have like where education comes in. That's where we do critical thinking. Because sometimes our judgment might be incorrect, like an optical illusion. Like it's just the specific way that my optical structure is designed, I can't actually see the thing as accurately as it really is. Like people who use glasses sometimes, right? I'm the minority in the room now, which is fine. But the existence of glasses is a good thing. To just be like, no, the way I see it is correct. And you would suffer more if we had an arrogant attitude like that, right? So critical thinking is the way that we make sense of the judgments or socialization or categorization, which inherently is philosophy, right? It's not like when you use religion to make sense of these things, it's just about your version of what you think God is. Which again, where does that come from? It comes from some human. Right? There's no geological evidence of God. Like it's not like there's this like pillar or like these geological layers. Like if you have the earth, right? And then there's people here. And then farther down you dig, there's just more evidence of God. Whatever it would be. You can anything you want. What you have to say is all of it's God. And it's just everything. But it's not like, there was a Bible every layer. You just keep on going. There's just Bibles all the way down to like the core of the earth. And the deeper you go, they're made of different material so that they don't decay or get, in like the molten magma of the center or core of the earth. There's like magma Bibles. It just doesn't make sense. Like you're crazy. What are you talking about? No. The Bibles are up here with the humans. And same with all the other scripture, the Quran, the Torah, doesn't matter what it is. Right? And then the people talking about UFOs, and they're like, there's UFOs going around, and there's, the cable. That doesn't make any sense because there's no evidence of that. Right? Or ghosts. There's other weird things in the cosmos. No, doesn't make sense. Right? What we have the earth, there's the sun, there's the moon, there's like stars, and we're trying to make sense of all that. There's animals. Like there is a cosmos. And that's what we got. Right? And so with humans, there is this stuff going on. And we know that humans, they're a little, violent sometimes or other things. And so how do we create some balance on this planet that we're currently on? Well, we have to look at what is. We have to do an assessment. And we talked about being empirical before. So one of our skills, empirical, what is? Which is another way of saying what exists. And this area is going to lead us to our epistemological zone Like, how do we know what we know? And there are certain problems we can get into epistemologically, but we don't know down a rubber band. So when I talk about what is, I'm saying these exist. And to say that they shouldn't exist doesn't make sense, right? The existence part is not the problem. It's more about the content of socialization. It's like saying gravity just shouldn't exist. It's like, okay, time shouldn't exist. Time doesn't exist, right? It's like, that's just, okay. Like we can go back to the tower and have these discussions, and you're probably just going to stay in the tower. You're not going to get very far, right? Like when people say there's no such thing as truth, or you cannot know anything, those guys are in the tower. And sometimes this tower, the mirror side of the tower, of the philosopher's tower, is the insane asylum. Because anybody you go out into the street and you ask certain philosophical questions, they're like, oh, you're crazy. Okay, hi. You dress really well, but you're insane, right? People don't know what the hell you're talking about, because you're probably talking about nonsense. It's just that you got really, really good at it, right? Is that philosophy? Maybe, right? You got a PhD. People acknowledge me that I know what I'm talking about. Well, nobody else knows what you're talking about. You can't make sense of it. What I'm trying to say is that there are these things that exist, okay, for human beings specifically. So their existence, it's useless for us to, we can discuss it, but to try to remove them doesn't make any sense. That's like taking the blood out of your body. How's that going to do for you, right? Unless you're going through dialysis and there's a specific process here, but that's not what's going on. So these things are part of it, and there's more of them. So now what do we do with them? We need some way to evaluate if these are like little machines and they generate something, they produce some kind of a product, X, Y, Z. We can now evaluate the content of socialization. And critical thinking is a process evaluator, right? Whereas religion is a content contraster. It's saying if you are not, remember the socialization thing, if your hands aren't like this, therefore it's wrong, right? But where did this come from? It came from a specific place. Whereas the critical thinking is looking at the mechanism itself, right? If it doesn't matter how you put your hand, as long as the food goes in here and it's not poison, right? Well, but this is not food, okay? Right? It just starts to go down a weird way. So there's a difference between the two, right? And it could be authoritarianism. It could be veganism. It's really, there's content belief systems, and then there is the meta-ordered mechanism to evaluate all of them. And this, in some ways, goes back to language. It's the function of language. So we can use this to understand how we categorize things, to understand how we make judgments. And all of that stuff, we want to structure our social group with it in mind, but applying the critical thinking function to it at all times. And so that's why we're over here, right? With being Socratic and the critical feedback stuff. And so, yeah. And so the reason I'm saying this is because how far down does it go? Well, it stops with this stuff. And it stops with this stuff. Why? Partly because of the cosmos. This is just what we're working with, right? We're just in this reality that we call a cosmos. And because we're human, right? I said before, if you're AI or some kind of alien, maybe it's different for you. Maybe there are aliens that can access other universes. Maybe, right? So maybe time and space is different for them. Not really sure. That's unfalsifiable at this point because we have nothing to test. But for us as human beings in this specific state without AI interface, we have socialization, categorization, judgment, and there's other functions that we'll get to later. And so these things, right, affect certain biases like groupthink and how we can mitigate those biases. because socialization is part of why groupthink exists. That we want a decision by Friday. We made a commitment to this client, this is a business context, that our proposal will be ready by Friday or whatever. And it looks bad on us as a business if we don't meet those conditions. So even though you've raised issues with the way that the calculations were done, or the materials we have, right? Or the main person who's on the job died, you know what I mean? And no one's trained. There's just certain things that occur. From a business standpoint, from the company's brand, none of that shit matters. You just need to produce independent of what's going on, right? So even the way that, not just groups, but the way that business itself is conceptualized, right, leads to these problems. Because we're intolerant of any kind of a company not meeting its goals or making its commitments on time. It's like, no, because the competitor, right, and business is under the realm of capitalism. The competitor will says it will do it, right? It's like, can they? Maybe, sure. And so part of the problem here is the motivation, the monetary motivation. Okay. So groupthink has a function in some kind of social group under the heading of an economic system of capitalism, that the only thing that really matters is the acquisition of resources or capital. That's all that really matters in that system, right? That's another one of these things. And so now, you can jump in at any time. Economics is really the founding, it is more foundational than religion, authoritarianism, and other belief systems. It really is. That's what we use to regulate countries that violate human rights issues, right? We put sanctions on them. We don't buy stuff from them. But there are problems with economic principles when they are seen as an end in itself and not a means to an end. There needs to be some other end in itself, something that is higher ordinate, more important as a category than just how many resources do I have or how many resources do we have, right? And so what is that?
Well, business and economics is inherently melioristic.
Okay.
So its nature is to help people fix problems, improve lives.
Okay, melioristic.
Yeah.
How do I spell it? M-I-L.
MELIORISTIS.
Okay. Cool. I didn't know about that term. So it's and you're saying we define it as helping people with their lives?
Yeah, so you have a problem, which is a need needs to be fulfilled. That's where demand comes in. Supply offers a solution, the best solution available. And if that solution meets your needs, then you exchange money.
Okay.
The concept of money is also, well, they don't have any evidence of chaos within economics, but in terms of just money itself, because it's an abstract concept, it's related to chaos.
Okay. Yeah, you just okay, cool. Yeah. So what I would say is that these elements of our psychosocial nature are more fundamental than the melioristic economic perspective. Why? Because these things affect this. It can be a positive feedback between them, but you can't have this without any of these, right? Which is to say that this only exists with humans. Maybe there's some little economic system within animals, but it's contingent on the animals. It's contingent on the being itself. And so the value for some kind of a normative group, right, or our ideal, what we ought to do, the only way to get there is through some manipulation or awareness or, I don't know, management of these fundamental properties, these elements. It's like saying, I want to make the best car. But you have to make the car out of some physical material using some energy. There are some fundamental forces and materials or elements that in some orientation will give you the Tesla or the whatever, Ford Escape or whatever you want to talk about, right? And so any kind of economic system that is successful or social group, right, is going to be based on these kinds of properties. So last time I talked about some skills to help out with these things. And fundamentally, I wanted to look at what are the phenomena or properties that underlie, what really makes a group or where a group is composed of in some ways, right? And that's where we get the socialization, categorization, judgment, which in some ways are social functions, but also cognitive functions of the mind. Like memory could be another one. We talked about that over here, right? Our capacity to remember or to retain information is inherently important just in how we function. And each of these elements are going to have a different kind of effect on the orientation or how we relate to each other, right? What I remember about you matters for how I communicate with you, what I do, right? Mm-hmm. I think that's good for today for this. And we can talk a little bit if you want to talk about some stuff before we're finished for today. Anything on your guys' mind?
So like with intangibles being a focus in business now, it's everyone's trying to scramble to figure out like how to sort of categorize everything, diagnose problems, prescribe solutions and stuff like that. And usually that's the area of management consultants. But what they're working on is something similar to this.
Cool.
Like socialization is a big part of it. Right now they're focused on knowledge, the different types of knowledge and how the knowledge spreads within an organization, sort of multiplying the value of each individual.
Okay.
And then it's sort of I don't know how to describe it. It's like the Gestalt effect things, like put two things together and you get something more than just the sum of its parts.
Yeah, that's good. I like that.
Yeah.
The whole is greater than some of those parts.
Yeah, something like that. Because financially, the intrinsic capital or assets are like 10 times more than the actual physical and financial assets of a company. Mm-hmm. So like you get a company and if it has like 5 billion in assets, but the market cap of it might be like a couple trillion or something. That's the intrinsics. Okay. At work or whatever. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's important to understand how all the parts fit together, because like the whole is like how we would categorize the entity in its entirety, right? That's like saying it's an authoritarian state or it's like a philosophy society. And like, what do you want the whole to be? You know? And so if the company, like if the company gets, and this changes, right? But if a company gets labeled as an unethical company, now that's the perception of the company and that will affect like whether people want to do business with it or, right? And that could be like whoever was in charge of that ship hitting the Baltimore Bridge recently, right? That makes the organization that was in charge of the shipping logistics responsible to some degree. And so people are less likely, they'll probably fire somebody so that they get scapegoat that person and say it was their fault. Don't blame the company itself because we don't want to go out of business or whatever, you know? And the most likely will be like an investigation and then whatever. But yeah.
Yeah, they usually call that intrinsic liabilities as
Mhm.
opposed to an asset like say Apple, whatever, their iPhone. That's part of an intrinsic asset. But ExxonMobil's oil spill or something.
Yeah, yeah.
That's a liability. So
Yeah. And these things are important when we in this capitalistic society, that there is some responsibility on one end to reduce intrinsic liability. You know, like the company may have lost what, like $1 billion, Exxon, but the effect on the environment is like, how do you even really calculate it? You know what I mean? It's non-monetary to some degree. Like we can calculate the cleanup, but then like the loss of wildlife, it's hard to put a price tag on that. You know what I mean? And these things matter to us. Like the earth, just as a rock, doesn't care, right? It's the organisms that live on that rock that it matters to. And some of those organisms don't have the awareness to know about it. We do, to some degree. Some of us do. But like, I don't know if anyone's seen that documentary, The Corporation. Came out like 20 years ago. But they basically just say that the way that a corporation is structured is akin to just being a psychopath. Like it as an entity doesn't really care about anything than its own survival. And because of the structure of like having a board of directors and shareholders and everyone's individual interest, collectively makes this entity that will do unethical things to promote its survival, right? Because it's based on, because of the problem that this monetary, value, like of capitalism, is more important than anything else, really, right? And yeah, and that's kind of where the world is like, how do we deal with the right to private property? Because that's what it's founded on. If you didn't have a right to your own private property, capitalism couldn't exist. It wouldn't make sense. But the fact that you do, and you can continually accumulate more of that private property, and there's all of these laws and policies and organizations to protect that, those that know how to manipulate those laws, policies, and organizations become very successful, right? In a capitalistic framework. And so, it's not that we don't, and then so just like the renegade philosopher, there's like the renegade economist who says, we don't need private property, we don't need capitalism, we don't need money, we don't need banks. I'm not going to say that that's the answer, right? Going that far down the path of just being so extreme that you just try to get rid of everything. I just think, and I didn't study economics, so I don't have a solution for that yet. But I do know that there is an area there that we do need to figure something out. How do we structure what ownership is, and then how do we trade between each other if ownership is a thing, in such a way that we don't have this disparity between, the top 1% owning, like 90-something% of all the wealth, and then people just can't even survive, like they have no place to live. Like, do you really need the yacht at that point? Like, what well-being, if we calculated psychologically the well-being increase, if we did an fMRI scan before the yacht, during the yacht, and after the yacht, it'd probably be very similar to people that win the lottery. Then maybe there's a spike for 6 months, but then it goes back down to baseline, because the yachtness doesn't really matter. It's how you get along with your partner. If they're mad at you and you can't comfortably sleep together, right? That has way more impact on your well-being, assuming that you're like a normal person, you're not like someone who's psychologically fucked, like you're a psychopath or whatever, than the yacht, right? But this private property issue makes it so that people like oligarchs can rule a country. And it's like, well, what is that going to do for us? What do you think the solution is to this economic? Like, how do you solve the problem of like a very few percentage of individuals owning all of the wealth of the world, basically? Just throw that one at you. It's like, there you go.
So you need to, like, I don't really know, but you need to factor in, the Christians basically,
Okay.
because they have their own like agenda when it comes to everything, including money. And it affects a lot of things um, like if you take Wall Street, for example, and the analysts, how they give you recommendations for whatever, right? A lot of them have, like, some of them have a win rate of 0. Some of them, a lot of them have a win rate below 50%. Which, like, 50% is a coin toss. It's the same thing.
Yeah.
Either you buy it or you sell it or you don't look at it, right? When you have something below 50%, that means there's some politics going on there, because you can't lose out that much. Like, it's just too hard. You got to intentionally do it.
Hmm.
But yeah, I mean, like, there's a lot of religion involved with Wall Street for some reason.
Okay.
I don't know why though.
I'm not sure. I'm not involved in it, so I didn't study it. Yeah, I think part of from what I see is we need to figure out what it means to own something and how much can we own. Because if I have the right to do whatever I want with everything I own, that means there's no reason for me to ever give anything to anybody else. And that's, in some ways, the definition of a conservative political party is that why should taxes exist at all? Why does it matter?
Yeah, and that's another part of the problem is that so religion is on the right, conservatives are on the right, and economics is on the right. So economics is based off of risk taking. Conservatives, by definition, don't take risks ever. That's that's what religious people like to, for whatever reason. And when you have a bunch of people who don't understand or take risks, it poses a big problem, because for you to create any kind of wealth for yourself and create more property for yourself, there's risk involved for everyone. So like Canada, like I forgot what the comparison was like, but Canada doesn't Canada is like an ultra conservative country when it comes to money, opposed to the US.
Really?
Yeah. And that difference, you can see the difference in terms of property ownership and per capita income and stuff like that. It's basically the conservatism that and the risk taking, or the aversiveness to risk, that's a big part of the problem. It's not as simple as, like, the assumption here is that that rich guy made his money fairly, but in all likelihood he didn't. They probably had a connection to a senator, Congress, to Wall Street, and they had access to capital. So
yeah, this is like a corruption thing, right? It's like in organizations.
yeah, big time.
Like, how do you know that people are following the rules or whatever? And so going with that, we would have to have a calculation on the board here to say, what can we do to prevent corruption? And fundamentally, I would just say it has to do with socialization. I would have to be, like Aristotle would agree, that teaching people from when they're young, like when they're kids, socializing them. But part of the problem, again, we just go right back to it, is that psychopaths inherently may be inadvertent to socialization. They just don't respond because of the way that they process the relation between group and others. or sorry, self and others. You know, the way that they see themselves and other people is just you're all objects and I would be a different thing, you know? And so that's why an organization is necessary, because when we say organization, what we mean is we have, it's like go back to the game, not game theory, but game analogy, is that if we all play by these rules, because the psychopath might just take the ball and throw it in the net when no one's looking, right? But the reason you can't do that, like what are the reasons you can't do that in soccer? If you want to win soccer, you just grab it and just throw it in there. No one's looking, haha, haha, like the banker in Monopoly. There's the rules. What else exists in that context?
There's an opposing team.
There's the team, yeah. There's one more big factor. The audience. Is that 1,000 people are watching you, right? But in Monopoly, where's the audience? As soon as I can like throw something over there, like you could rig the game, right? Like people try to do that with casinos for however long, you know what I mean? They're trying to change it so that the other team, the house, just doesn't know. And then they can like do whatever. They have like a card. Like that's like the trope. It's like there's the card in your fucking sleeve or whatever, right? Mm-hmm. Or you're on my team, but you're wearing the other jersey. You know what I mean? That's why it has to be like society. Like all that's the justification, because we need the audience, which was just everybody. You know? And that's like certain principles of making things transparent. Like there's certain things that we could do. You know what I mean? Like not allowing certain kinds of NDAs, for example. It's just you can't do that because the only reason you're doing that is that you can fucking cheat. You know? Like why else are you doing it? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And another criticism would be like, what about mass surveillance? Like we just have cameras everywhere. You know, like Big Brother's always watching. And that could come from good intentions, but it could also be the alternative where it's like, you know, we're imposing on people's right to privacy. You know, and what is the limit of our privacy? Like, how far does that really go? So, because you like crimes and like unethical behavior or cheating in the sense of what like a psychopath would do, to them it's not cheating. To them it's just winning. I'm winning. I'm going to win. You just lost. I didn't cheat. You just lost. That's what losers say. Like that kind of an attitude. Just asshole attitudes. Like you are an asshole. You know? I make the rules. Like that kind of a very arrogant, putting themselves, it's a little narcissistic too, putting themselves above other people. Right? And I think that the main point is that you're never really going to get rid of that. It's just that we can structure things so that they're at a great disadvantage. It's almost impossible for them to, you know, do it in some ways. And we just go back to the well-being thing. It's like, what do you really need to feel good, to be good, to have a good life? The answer is you don't need the fucking yacht. Like maybe you can, but like super yachts with a helicopter and like what's like we can say okay, maybe, but first there's probably other things to deal with as a humanity than that, you know? Mm-hmm. Or like, sorry.
If there's no limitation of being rich, then you can buy whatever you want. If the society would put a limit on how much wealthy you can be, maybe that's gonna make a difference, but who's gonna do that?
That's the problem, is because it's inherently not in your interest. And you are every single individual, they would say no, right?
Wow.
Because what if I win the lottery?
Potentially, yeah, I could be rich.
Right?
That's why I don't want to
Yeah.
be limited.
But that's just like, it's like a fallacy. It's like for you to, because that would mean that you're going to take all of that wealth from those other people. And they're looking down at you saying, no, you're not. I'm making sure that you're not. I have an army ready to go. At any point in time, I press the button, my army goes in. Right? How much does an army cost? If you have like $100 billion or whatever, you know, like the US is like voting on, or maybe hopefully someday, to give $65 billion roughly to Ukraine. That's an army. That's literally what it is, to fight the Russian army, right? So if you have $1 trillion, right?
The war will never stop if the US gonna continue to support Ukraine.
Well, that's not true. The Russian people might finally
Well,
stand up.
At least it's gonna be, I don't know, continuous for I don't know how many.
Yeah, it's the problem is that if it's not going to end in Ukraine, right? And it's up to the Ukrainians if they want to stop or not. It's not up to us. If someone's on the ground screaming, "Help me! Help me!"
I'm not
Help me.
even sure if it's up to Ukrainians anymore. It's
Well,
gone too far,
Okay,
and it's always been US involved. So,
it's not only the U.S. though. There's like 50 countries that have all been supporting Ukraine,
yeah, true.
like all of NATO. You know, all democratic societies basically that say that you have a right to have freedom and to not be controlled by a person in power. And so that goes back to like, should you live in an authoritarian state or a democratic state? And what is the difference between the two? What's more important? If you want to be in an authoritarian state, like maybe there's a reason. We can talk about that. I've explained it before, is that it just means that you don't matter and the person in power is the most important. So you don't have a right to property because the authority can just take it from you. I say, no, you don't have a right to your family. You don't have a right to your anything. You have no rights. And we've been in those states. That has kind of been the history of humanity.
Yeah, right now in the occupied territories, the Russians just take whatever they think and nobody cares.
Including people.
Exactly. Like I have my close friends who lost everything, like all their businesses, all their properties, just because they don't want to go back and they don't want to get the Russian passport and everything just being taken. That's it.
And so, like, I think it goes back to what does it mean to be human? And what principles can we agree on, like human rights, that are worth, that make living worth it? Like the right to free speech, for example, or the right to bodily autonomy, you know, the right to not have your children taken away from you and forced into some Russian family and lied to about where they come from.
Here, actually, too, I just found out you can change your gender for free. Once you turn 18, I think.
Like surgically, you mean? That's a different topic entirely.
I know, but I just can't do it.
We can talk about that.
That's insane.
Mm-hmm.
You know, some people are waiting for their, I don't know, cancer to be cured or the surgery to be done years. And this type of surgery is being done within a couple of weeks.
Yeah. One of the
Yes,
arguments is
yeah.
like, if gender dysphoria is a mental illness, right, then it should be treated as an illness, which means you shouldn't get surgery. If it's not a mental illness, then it shouldn't be covered under OHIP because it's not an illness.
Exactly. Like a plastic surgery, yeah, sure. They, I don't know, couple $100 and do it. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
but it's free.
I disagree with that, and I think that it's uncritical to approach it.
Reasonable, exactly.
Yeah. Like, I think that there's a lot of dogmatic beliefs, like you can't ask questions when it comes to the gender discussion. And as soon as you do, you're labeled as a transphobe. And that's just kind of like a militant, unphilosophical way to discuss what's going on, which in a lot of ways is based on emotional reasoning, right?
Sure.
And we can have emotions about things, but fundamentally it's important for us to talk about it. If gender dysphoria does not exist, then it's just like a woman that wants to get breast implants, right? Should that be free for her too? You know,
Mhm.
it seems more appropriate that like a dental plan for all Canadians, which isn't going through at the moment, it is more related to health, because it's not your choice fundamentally if you genetically have teeth that aren't the
Mhm.
best, or just that you've been aging and there's problems, right? But yeah, like either gender dysphoria is a mental health sickness and should be treated as a mental illness, and then we would cover it as a mental illness. And if it's not a mental illness, then it's cosmetic and should be treated as every other cosmetic surgery. Like if you want to get your lips done or your nose done or whatever, right? But to say that I have like rhinoplastic phoria, like I'm so upset with my nose and how my nose looks that I'm going to have surgery done to get it corrected, you know, is basically the same thing. Like I have like an Italian nose. There's like a little ball at the front of my nose, right? So I could be like, oh my God, I want to kill myself because I don't like how my nose isn't perfect. You know, like don't label me as somebody with an Italian nose. Like that's just how I was born. And if I don't like that, then, you know, I can change myself, but it's not everybody else's responsibility to do that. And I think Canada is taking an incorrect step with a lot of its gender policies because they don't make sense. And as soon as you talk about it, it becomes authoritarian. People get angry at you and they try to coerce you, just like an authoritarian government. Like, is this supposed to be a trans authoritarian state? It's not a religious state, it's a trans state. Like, what does that mean? Like, that's where the world's come today? I don't like, because you don't have a right to free speech. There's not peaceful protests, there's violent protests and a lot of aggression, right? Like recently there was like a trans person, like a teenager that was murdered by two other teenagers in England. And that's completely wrong. It's not right to kill people,
Mhm.
you know, because they're confused about their gender identity. Or
Yeah.
they would say, we're confused about their gender identity. Okay. There's confusion about this person's gender identity, whether the confusion's in them or society. That doesn't mean that society should be killing them. That's wrong. And it was, you know, like it's not appropriate to that was a tragedy. It's not appropriate for that person or their family. And the two people, you know, I don't know if they got charged with manslaughter or if they're in the process of getting charged because they're minors or something going on. They're in jail. They're in jail though. Like there's court proceeding going on.
Mhm.
And so I'm not saying that I'm not enabling that kind of a behavior, but I'm saying that it's important that we utilize critical thinking because that's at the one end of the extreme, right? And so neither of these extremes are the correct approach to trans issues. But understanding the role of the mind is how we make sense of this, right? And whether or not resources from our collective tax should be used for that is contingent on the condition itself. And for a medical intervention means that it's a form of illness. So that is. And so the trans person would want to say that they're not ill, that there's something wrong with the body or whatever, you know, it's not an illness. That's one argument at least. And so it seems contradictory to say that though, right? And again, that's why it doesn't make sense. And so I think that sometimes politically, people will try to get votes by just making everybody happy and not really looking at, not breaking down what the issues are. because some people will be unhappy and they'll lose votes or look bad. And I don't think, like, so that kind of would put me, people could perceive me as conservative. I don't consider myself as such.
Mm.
But, because conservatives would say that we need to take away the rights of women for pro-choice, right? For Roe versus Wade. And I think that a pro-life approach can be a problem. I think pro-choice is better because it respects the autonomy of the woman, and it is her body that is fundamentally harboring the unborn fetus for her. So, yeah, but conservatives predominantly would accept pro-life, right? So I'm not that, and so I'm a centrist. I'm in the center. So both of those, like the conservative Republican approach on the extreme and the Democratic liberal approach, both have issues, and they're not being critical, right? And extremists kind of like sit themselves in there, whether it's a trans extremist that is trying to manipulate policies because of certain things that they may believe, certain content that they're not applying critical thinking or being philosophical about. And on the other end, religious extremists that are imposing scripture that is not fact-based, right? Does not represent our understanding of biology or consciousness in any way. And trying to have policy and laws, meaning you can go to jail, right? Like it has serious consequences. Like you can go to jail. Like if you're a doctor and you're unwilling to perform a surgery on an 18-year-old boy or girl who says they're trans, like you could lose your license now if that's the case, right? So it has professional implications and ethical implications. It's a big deal. Like who is in power in the government? Because that's, or what policies get decided on, you know? So that's why being philosophical is important. And as a philosophy society or a group of people, not only do we have the side of what we're doing, we need to make sense of things so we know what decisions to make. If we don't know how to make sense of stuff, then we can't make the right decisions. Good?
Mhm.
Cool. All right, everybody, next week.